Hey guys, yeah, I haven't done a video in a very long time. I've been busy, but let's just get straight to it. Um, so this video is about the stakes of the political, and I think that if we begin the conversation by saying Republicans, Democrats, something that Trump did, um, that we are already caught up in the story that is sort of driving this whole thing. I think what I'm asking for to reconsider what we think is political is to zoom out for a second. If you zoom out, what you will discover is that capitalism is an incentive structure, and it has certain elements within it that we can create stories about it. Now, unfortunately, those stories are tied to the incentive structure itself. Um, this also applies to critiquing the way people critique capitalism, is essentially another way of saying that they present a new story about capitalism, about how they believe it functions and how it works. The issue is that when we believe too strongly about how it works and how it functions, is that we will sort of overlook the origin, um, because the origin of capitalism, this point of transitioning from feudalism to capitalism, um, was a variety of factors. Of course, if you listen to Zizek will give you a kind of nice, and I'm referring to his earliest work, Sublime Object of Ideology, where he talks about how feudalism to capitalism was when the commodity sort of changed the relationships between men, whereas in feudalism, it was a sort of a direct slave master relationship. But once the commodity sort of surfaced, then now we have, under this guise of commodity, to have equal relations with each other, right? I am equal so long as I can get what I want, essentially. Um, we are equal so long as we can exchange equally, and so on. This is what capitalism for Zizek presents. Um, of course, what Zizek is going to say is that actually this kind of guise of equality via exchange of the commodity is simply just a way to obfuscate the unequal relations that we've struggled forever with ourselves, with human beings. Um, so when we ask this question, why does capitalism work so well? To put it simply, it works so well because it managed to drive itself without human beings interfering with it, essentially. And this is the point at which we're at today. Um, when you sort of look at Nick Land's theory of accelerationism, he didn't even coin accelerationism actually, but when you start pairing accelerationism with Nick Land and how capitalism is just this thing in itself that sort of runs without the human being, we already had created this relation, believe it or not. Um, because if you look at capitalism, as an incentive structure, um, what, and here's the question to ask and to think about is, when you ask this question, what's an incentive structure that can accommodate all human difference? And to put it simply, the reality of the situation would be to simply say, well, it would be an incentive structure that basically has nothing to do with the human, which is what we're going to realize over the past 20 years now, ever since Nick Land sort of started pushing forth his theory in the 1990s. So when we're talking about this sort of critique of capitalism, I want to be careful here, because what we are doing is we're giving and presenting a story. And what is considered political for Andrew Luber and I is the fact that when we present criticism about political structures, that essentially we are telling stories. And we have been telling stories about capitalism for a long time. Now, of course, the danger is believing in those stories, essentially what Nick Land is doing. Because once you believe in those stories, then at least the story that Nick Land's giving, well, there is no human involved. And yet there's a human telling you, describing to you what capitalism is doing. Only we can tell stories. Only humans can tell stories about humans not being involved in a story. That's the sort of ironic part about it all. The real question to ask when it comes to, in my opinion, when it comes to what it means to be political is, what are the kinds of subjectivities that we perpetuate under this incentive structure? What is the story? What are the stories that we are telling ourselves through this incentive structure, i.e. capitalism? And then for me, the political act is to then ask, to then seek out, demand, transform, however we want to go about it, is how do we transition from one incentive structure to another incentive structure? Because from feudalism to capitalism is very interesting, right? There was death, there was technology, there's a variety of factors, and everyone has their kind of varying opinion about how it goes from here to here, and it depends how much of a historical take you want to assert in there, or you want to take a more theoretical take, which will definitely paint a bit different pictures, similar to Zizek when he sort of describes it as a master slave relationship, and then capitalism is just a pseudo equality that's still under the guise of a master slave relationship. All I want to say is, if that's true, then the question of how do we transition from one one incentive structure to another would be to ask, how can we create, or how can we propose an incentive structure where it accommodates human difference, but also not eliminate the human being? Because essentially, the best answer that we have come up with is capitalism. Capitalism seems like the only thing that ironically can accommodate human difference, precisely because it eliminates the human, completely detached from the situation. If we look back to, Martin Luther King what we consider political acts that sort of change the course and direction of certain things. It stopped segregation, essentially, the movements from Martin Luther King and I'm forgetting the other guy's name. But essentially, is even though those changes happen, those changes were still within the same incentive structure. And if those changes still take place within those incentive structures, we have to really ask ourselves if political change is happening itself. Because the way I interpret political change is more or less changing from one incentive structure to another. I think those, what we call political actions, were themselves simply ethical actions. Ethical actions that the system itself, the incentive structure that did not already have ingrained within it or yet symbolized to make it possible. So again, a real political action might involve switching. How do we switch from one incentive structure to another? How do we go from capitalism to another? And of course, it's what communism has been trying to figure out for a while. How do you promote a resistance? How do you how do you gather the proletariat? How do you move? But I think the real question to say is, I think there's two elements that we have to consider. We have to consider, one, we have to fight against the cynicism and the sort of messianic waiting for something to change, which, in order to combat this, we have to tell different stories. We have to tell different stories that involve the human being in order for us to even begin thinking about what kind of incentive structures are possible. The second step is that a new incentive structure is only possible if we change or prepare. I think the better term would be prepare. If we prepare subjectivity for that upcoming incentive structure. My belief, the reason, this is just my belief here, my naive belief about communism, is that the reason why communism fails or continues to fail is not because it's a dumb idea. I think the reason why it continues to fail is because fundamentally it is not preparing subjectivity to change. What happens is there's this belief that one must simply gather, build camaraderie, I can't even say that word, build comradeship and a kind of unity and provoke change, sort of incentivize some type of resistance and push against the system, against the incentive structure itself. But I think even if it works, it fails because you did not prepare the subjects to engage with that kind of incentive structure in the first place. And what I mean by this is, I don't just mean those who believe in Marxism. I'm talking about those that don't believe in Marxism, because that is what will also pose an issue. And this always comes down to the same thing, which is, how do we accommodate, how do we create an incentive structure that accommodates human difference, that doesn't eliminate it, How do you prepare subjectivity to transition to that new incentive structure? And what are the conditions to set forth for that new incentive structure? I don't think we even have close to the best answers for those. Because again, it really involves the most difficult thing, which is human difference. Simply put, it's human difference. Capitalism wins at the end of the day precisely because it's the only thing that can accommodate, in a very pseudo way, accommodate human difference. Again, precisely because it can go without the human. But we need to start telling stories with the human involved, stories that present new ways of being and relating to an incentive structure. In many ways, capitalism could change if we simply tell a new story about how we should relate to commodity, etc., ourselves, and anything. It could. But because we're so obsessed with looking at the facts of the situation, the facts of the situation, as we call it, become the stories that we tell ourselves, and then there is no, quote, hope left, right? We fall into this sort of capitalism realism where, it's the famous quotes from Mark Fisher where, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than change capitalism. But for me, that's just proof of storytelling. That's just proof of how good we believe and are immersed in these stories. But anyways, that's enough for me. All right, take care.